You can have your
Main event of the evening.
ready to race to you.
These days are
Hello and welcome to These Days Are Ours, a Happy Days podcast. I'm Peter.
And I'm Joe.
And today we are discussing Season 2, Episode 6 of The Fonz and the Happy Days Gang, Fjords and Sorcery.
Okay, Peter, tell us what happens in Fjords and Sorcery.
Outside of a small village, Eric the blacksmith's son is facing off against Grimhild, a powerful sorceress with 2 pet wolves who seeks to rule the town.
We'll find a way to get free of your evil magic.
Thanks to her magic bracelet, Eric is no match for her, but he's saved from a magical bolt when the time machine appears right in front of him, intercepting it.
What magic is this?
Hi! Is this Milwaukee?
Unfortunately for the gang inside of it, the machine is turned into a massive tent. When they demand she turn the machine back, Grimhild orders her pets to attack them, but Fonzie easily tosses them away.
You ought to keep these, four-footed furry balls on a leash. Otherwise they might hurt themselves. Amazing!
Grimhild vows revenge and vanishes. Eric calls Cupcake a fair maiden, and she says that 4th century Norway won't be so bad after all. Fonzie interrupts their love fest, complete with floating hearts in the air, to say they need to get the time machine back to normal. According to Eric, the only thing that can break Grimhild's spells is the other magic bracelet. Legend says it's hidden up the fjord and through the cliffs, so the gang take a boat and sail. From a distance, Grimhild summons forth a massive storm. With the ship about to crash into the rocks, Cupcake uses her powers, only to put everyone in floaties.
That's one word for it.
Eric calls her a mighty sorceress, encouraging Cupcake enough to try again. This time, she causes the sails to furl up. It's up to Fonzie to snap his fingers, causing the oars to jut out and throw the boat over the rocks. They reach land, and Eric says the bracelet is either in the old castle ruins or the ice caves. Richie suggests splitting up. He and Ralph go to the caves.
Gee, Ralph, it was terrific the way you jumped in to help me look for the bracelet.
Why not, Rich? After all, we're not gonna find anything down here.
While Fonzie, Cupcake, and Mr. Cool go to the castle, followed by Grimhild and her wolves. In the caves, Ralph pulls at what he thinks is a door handle embedded in the ice, only for the bracelet to slide onto his arm. In the castle, Grimhild's pets attack the gang, only for them to be saved by a convenient trap door.
You cannot escape me that easily, Fonzie.
As Ralph badly tries to hide the bracelet from Richie, the rest of the gang land in the cave. Grimhild has easily found them, and begins hurling fireballs at them. The gang run, followed by the wolves, and end up on a dead-end cliff. Grimhild makes Eric disappear, but the next fireball she throws is blocked by the sudden appearance of a solid wall of ice.
I'll take care of it.
Cuppers, don't do it.
Cupcake zaps the clouds away from the sky, causing the ice wall and the ice ledge they're standing on to start melting. Richie and Ralph fall off, and a panicking Ralph declares he doesn't want to fall.
I don't want to fall down there. Whoa!
The bracelet begins lifting him and Richie back up. They crash into a stalagmite, then through the ice wall. Ralph feebly lies to the rest of the gang about the bracelet, but there's only so much you can do when you're literally flying. The gang resolves to find Eric, and the bracelet starts dragging/guiding Ralph through the caves.
What are we gonna do, Fonz?
Well, there's only one thing to do, Red, and that's follow Mouth.
They end up in a forest outside, where they are again confronted by Grimhild. Cupcake demands to know where Eric is, and Grimhild says he's safe, but won't be for much longer. She's more interested in the other bracelet, but even though Ralph is perfectly willing to give it up, the bracelet ends up shocking her. Furious, she brings forth a massive vine from the ground and teleports away. Ralph tries to rip the vine out of the ground, only to get crushed underneath it, but it does disappear within seconds, so score 1 from Ralph. The wolves are about to attack, but Fonzie manages to knock one out using his jacket as a matador's cape, which Mr. Cool mimics with the other one. The gang find Eric, tied to a stone pillar and being taunted by Grimhild. Fonzie has a plan. Ralph does too. He goes and confronts Grimhild himself. Encouraged by his friends, he does battle with her, blocking a fireball by picking up another pillar.
Not as long as I've got my Mouth Doom Deflector.
We shall see, little man.
While Cupcake frees Eric by turning his ropes into flowers, Ralph trips, causing the bracelet to fly off. Grimhild takes it for herself, and turns into a giant, horned blue version of herself. Fonzie volunteers Cupcake to do magic battle with her. Cupcake's first zap is reflected back at her, shrinking her. Grimhild cackles that Cupcake is no sorceress, and Fonzie retorts that she couldn't shrink herself like that. Grimhild, of course, takes the bait.
You fool! With these bracelets, I can do anything!
and shrinks herself so small that the bracelets fall off. The time machine is back to normal, but more importantly, since the bracelets were too dangerous to keep as they are, Eric melted them down into a necklace for Cupcake. Most of the magic is gone, but not all of it, as Cupcake learns when she ends up in a Tutti Frutti hat.
Thank you, Peter. That was Fjords and Sorcery. It first aired back on October 24th, 1981. The Fonz and the Happy Days gang was followed by a new Richie Rich Scooby-Doo show. This week, Scooby and his pals get construction jobs. Later, they start a gardening service, but almost get eaten by a hungry plant.
Feed me.
And Scooby attends a football game only to wind up playing in the game himself. CBS continued to air the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show, and NBC served up a new episode of The Smurfs. This week, Gargamel transforms himself into a baby Smurf and is adopted by Smurfette. So, Peter, of those three choices, what are you watching?
I'm very curious about that episode of The Smurfs, because I feel like it would raise more questions about Smurf reproduction. Would the Smurfs not find it weird that there's just a new baby Smurf, considering that the last new Smurf to join them was Smurfette, and they know that she started out as a plot by Gargamel?
And I have to wonder, what is Gargamel's endgame in all of this? If only I can become a baby and be adopted by Smurfette, that would solve all my problems somehow.
Joe, I think you just stumbled onto someone's very specific fan fiction.
Fjords and Sorcery was directed by Ray Patterson, George Gordon, and Rudy Zamora. It was written by Diane Duane. Diane wrote Kelp earlier this season. In addition to her television work, Diane is a prolific author of fantasy and sci-fi novels.
The things I'm certain about, spiritually speaking, don't necessarily map closely onto any of the major religious systems.
As for guest stars this week, I want to point out Michael Bell as Eric.
You must be very powerful to stand up to Grimhild's magic.
Michael is an actor from Brooklyn whose voice is one of the most familiar from the 1970s and 80s. He has over 300 film, TV, and video game credits, including dozens of animated series. I remember him best as Zan, Gleek, and Riddler on Super Friends.
We're superheroes from another planet with lots of special powers that most of you Earthlings just don't have.
And as Plastic Man on the Plastic Man Comedy Adventure Show. But he was Duke on G.I. Joe, Handy Smurf on The Smurfs, Chaz Finster on Rugrats, Lance on Voltron, and at least 7 different characters on Transformers. And that's not even getting into his live-action work or his countless commercials and trailers. Peter, was the voice of Michael Bell instantly familiar to you as well, or did you not recognize him?
I did not recognize him, but I think that has more to do with the fact that he is very good at tailoring his voice to different situations, different characters, and different shows, which is always a plus. He's very versatile, and here he's kind of doing a very slight Scandinavian accent. It's not very heavy, but it is kind of noticeable, especially since I don't think Grimhild is doing one of those.
She is not at all. For some reason, Michael Bell's voice is permanently imprinted on my brain. Again, he did a lot of cartoons, but he also did a lot of commercials, and his voice turns up in odd places. If you watch the Star Wars Holiday Special, for instance, with the commercials on, you'll hear Michael do an ad for the Whiz.
All across the country, they're lining up on the yellow brick road.
Oh man, that is the most 1978 thing I can imagine. The Star Wars Holiday Special and The Whiz.
It's a match made in heaven.
It's a winning combination.
I was a big fan of The Whiz as a child for reasons that I don't entirely understand myself. I think it's because I had an undiagnosed anxiety disorder, and so Diana Ross's very neurotic Dorothy was more relatable to me than she probably should have been.
My name is Dorothy. Dorothy and Toto.
As for cultural and historical references in this episode, the term swords and sorcery, which describes a whole subgenre of fantasy fiction, was actually coined by author Fritz Leiber in 1961. Leiber used the term to refer to the works of Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian.
Grant me revenge. And if you do not listen, then the hell with you.
A fjord is a long, steep, narrow inlet created by glaciers. While the word is Norwegian in origin, fjords can be found outside of Norway as well. There are fjords in Canada, New Zealand, Chile, Scotland, and right here in the United States, Peter, so you don't have to leave America to find fjords.
Yay.
Our villainess is Grimhild.
Even if you defeat me, Grimhild, our village will never give in to your demands.
A character from Norse mythology, albeit a relatively minor one who appears in only one saga. She's a beautiful but evil sorceress who is married to the King of Burgundy and has 3 sons and 1 daughter. Her main thing seems to be tricking people into marrying other people under false pretenses. There's a second, apparently unrelated Grimhild who appears in another saga. She's also an evil sorceress. She poisons a king but winds up being burned to death. Peter, I have asked people I know who are into Norse mythology if they had heard of Grimhild? They said yes, but she is not really a top-tier character in that world. What would you say?
I'm inclined to agree. I'm also not entirely convinced that she is either of those Grimhilds. Given her slightly different MO from the other two Grimhilds, I'm going to say that she is another third sorceress named Grimhild. Maybe it's a Dread Pirate Roberts situation, and every so often there's just a new Grimhild the sorceress.
Just like there's a new Arnold in Milwaukee every few years.
Yes.
Grimhild has a pair of wolves, which is semi-appropriate because wolves are a significant part of Norse mythology. I say only semi-appropriate because there are no wolves specifically associated with Grimhild. Aww. Peter, do you associate wolves with Norse mythology?
You've got Fenrir, the wolf who eventually eats the sun during Ragnarok.
Would you say that they had to have wolves in a Norse mythology episode?
I wouldn't say they had to, but it's nice that they're there. They look very cool. They're very intimidating. They've got very detailed teeth. They're basically as far from Mr. Cool or Scooby-Doo or any other lovable Hanna-Barbera canine you can get.
The story takes place in Norway in the year 352 AD, but the Norse myths are not tied to any particular time period. In the 4th century, when this story is supposedly taking place, Norway was still in its Iron Age, a time during which the population grew and both agriculture and the written language developed. The Viking Age was still a few hundred years away. I think we see a few hints of Viking life in this episode.
Yeah, the boat we see, it's got the dragony head that some Viking boats had.
As near as I can tell, neither magic bracelets nor walls of water are prominent in Norse myth.
I'm sure there's got to be at least one magic bracelet in Norse mythology, but I do not remember where or when.
I can't remember where or when.
It does kind of seem like it's just there to have a magical MacGuffin.
I think Diane Duane is having some fun writing her own Norse mythology, basically. We see one of those supposed Viking helmets with horns on the side. Though helmets with horns have been worn since prehistoric times by various cultures throughout the world, they were not actually worn by Vikings. The association of Vikings with horned helmets began in the 1800s and the operas of Richard Wagner. That's why you get Elmer Fudd wearing one of those helmets.
I will do it with my spear and magic helmet. Your spear and magic helmet?
Or why you get Julianne Moore in The Big Lebowski wearing one of those helmets. And of course, Hagar the Horrible. Are you bothered when you see depictions of Vikings wearing the horned helmets? Some people are. They say, oh, that's not historically accurate.
I wouldn't say I'm bothered so much, but it does kind of make me roll my eyes. Come on, you can do a little bit of research. But also at the same time, they've become so associated with Vikings that if you don't have one, people are going to be like, hey, where are the horned helmets?
The "it could be raining" joke in this episode.
Find the bright side in this situation, Rich. I dare you. Well, it could be raining.
Is taken directly from Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein from 1974.
What a filthy job.
Could be worse.
How?
Could be raining.
They don't change it one little bit.
Is it original to Young Frankenstein, or does it even predate that? Because it feels like one of those jokes that's so old that it's been around since, 4th century Norway.
Fonzie says to Ralph, "You're no threat to Peter Pan. In case you've forgotten, Peter Pan is a character created by Scottish novelist and playwright J.M. Barrie. He is a mischievous boy who can fly, who never ages, and who lives on an island called Neverland." He debuted in a 1904 play called Peter and Wendy that was adapted into a novel in 1911. Is Peter Pan used up? Are we done with Peter Pan? What do you think now, Peter?
I suspect that 2015 Pan damaged his chances on the big screen. Maybe he could still make a comeback. I mean, that was 9 years ago, so maybe the time is right for a new big screen Peter Pan that does not cast Rooney Mara as Tiger Lily.
This isn't a game. You've seen what Blackbeard has done to Neverland already.
The thing is, even if they hadn't done that, it still would have been a really weird prequel, jukebox musical thing, where the bad guy is Blackbeard for some reason.
It's been a while since Fonzie and Mr. Cool have imitated Spanish bullfighters.
Relax, Fred. I can handle these overgrown greyhounds faster than you can say, Ole Mundo!
We last saw them do this in the pilot episode, King for a Day. Incidentally, ole is a Spanish interjection that may derive from the words ala or hola, but it's the spectators who say ole, not the matador.
So, I did not know that. All the bullfighting I absorbed secondhand through cartoons, and I did not know that.
Yeah, I learned that this week myself. The gang somehow find themselves at Stonehenge, or at least a place that looks a lot like Stonehenge. This is a mysterious landmark on the Salisbury Plain in the south of England. It may date back to 3000 BC and could have been used as a burial ground.
No one knows who they were or what they were doing.
Peter, what did you think the Stonehenge Monument was doing in this story?
I don't know. I wonder if it was a disconnect between script and animators. Okay, there needs to be this area with lots of stone pillars around, and the animators just defaulted to Stonehenge because that's one of the most instantly recognizable landmarks in the world.
No, we're not gonna do Stonehenge.
Fonzie calls Grimhild the Wicked Witch of the North.
I have been tricked.
Well, so much for the Wicked Witch of the North.
In L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from 1900, the Witch of the North is actually good, not wicked, and makes only one brief appearance in the book. Baum did not write about her in the subsequent Oz books. Despite what the movie may have told you, Glinda is actually the Good Witch of the South. So, Peter, I will assume that in the ensuing 124 years, other writers have filled us in on the Good Witch of the North. Have they not?
I think so, but I also don't remember anything about her. I'm sure that she had a lot to do in Gregory Maguire's Wicked, but I don't remember exactly.
She doesn't even get a name, I don't believe, in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, so she is a pretty minor character. Cupcake finds herself dressed as Carmen Miranda.
All the magic's gone out of it. Well, maybe most of the magic, anyway.
Carmen was a Portuguese-born singer, dancer, and actress who became extremely popular in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Her family emigrated to Brazil when she was very young, and she became known as the Brazilian bombshell.
Quanto le gusta, le gusta, le gusta, le gusta, le gusta, le gusta, le gusta. Oi.
Her signature accessory was a headpiece made of fruit. Very sadly, she became ill while working on the Jimmy Durante show and died in 1955 at the age of 46.
Most of what I know about her comes through cartoon osmosis. I'm more familiar with all the parodies of her than I am with her work itself.
Apparently in Brazil, she was a huge deal. 60,000 people attended her funeral. They named a street after her. Maybe it's time for a revival of interest in Carmen Miranda. Maybe there should be a Carmen Miranda biopic or something. Somebody should do that. Other observations this week. Once again, Diane Duane seems determined to put her own stamp on the show, which I very much appreciate. Not only do we start somewhere other than the time machine, we don't even see the time machine for most of the show. There is no damsel in distress this week. The villainess doesn't fawn over Fonzie. And for once, Cupcake gets a love interest.
Yeah, good for her.
I like that because of the bracelet, Ralph is confident enough to stand up to Grimhild.
Well, what have we here? It's Ralph Malph, hero at large.
And that the others encourage him to do so. Later, Fonzie is encouraging to Cupcake, so that's something we don't often see on this show. But the best bit of animation in the entire episode has Grimhild leaping toward the camera while turning into a wolf. I am positive this was the scene that most interested the animators.
Yes. It rules.
All through this episode, Grimhild looks like someone who should be airbrushed on the side of a van.
Down by the river.
She's this long-haired sorceress with these two pet wolves. There's this part where she just jumps right out at you. This is a Cupcake-heavy episode, so Cupcake says a lot of catchphrases this week. I'll try to get through them as quickly as possible. Near the beginning of the episode, she just says cause rather than cosmic calamities.
Cos, what happened to my time machine?
She then says,
suffering sunspots, galloping goosebumps, cosmic comets, moon craters. Later she says quadruple moon craters, ominous asteroids, leaping liftoffs, fabulous futons. I swear she says this instead of her usual perilous plutons. A few seconds later she says perilous plutons, terrible time warps, leaping leptons, cosmic calamities 3 times, Neptune's moons, creeping cosmos, suffering Saturn, cosmic crisis, and leaping light years.
So Diane Duane, in some ways, is changing up the formula, but in some ways she's leaning on it more heavily than ever. This is a pretty light week for Mr. Cool. He's not a big part of this story, but there was one time when he made things better. He accidentally leans on a lever that opens a trapdoor, allowing Fonzie, Cupcake, and Eric to escape.
One last addition to the times he made things better counter. We see near the beginning when the time machine has been turned into a tent, he is scrambling to keep it from blowing away in the wind. He's scrambling to keep it attached to the ground. So good on you for that, Mr. Cool. If you hadn't, they would have been trapped in 4th century Norway.
Good initiative, Mr. Cool. As for times when Mr. Cool makes things worse, there were none that I could see, and I have to wonder, has the curse of Mr. Cool been lifted? What do you think?
I don't want to jinx it, but I think so.
I hope so. I think maybe he's realizing, oh, if I screw up enough, they could just leave me somewhere and just go off without me. Here were the times when Mr. Cool suffers physically and mentally this week. A sail hits him, and then a Viking helmet lands on him. Ralph lands on him, and then he falls into a pit with the wolves and is almost eaten. So a pretty routine week for Mr. Cool.
Yes.
So, Peter, were there any outstanding Happy Days fashions in Fjords and Sorcery?
As you mentioned, Grimhild consistently looks awesome throughout this episode. She's got this amazing flowing dress and a fabulous cape, and she's got the bracelet that she loves posing with. It's so cool.
Peter, did you have any other observations you wanted to make about Fjords and Sorcery?
This is a pretty good episode for Ralph. He defends his friends, he stands up to a powerful sorceress. But on the other hand, I do wonder why he initially kept trying to hide the bracelet from everyone else. Was he originally thinking about bringing it back to Milwaukee in 1957?
Yes, I believe that was his game plan. Diane Duane also wrote Kelp, in which Ralph again wants to take something valuable so he can pawn it later. But he also might be worried that the bracelet will bring undue attention and possibly danger to himself. So he's like, oh, this thing, yeah, it's nothing. I've had this forever. I think that might have been his concern. Having this bracelet might put him in the line of fire, so to speak, which it does.
Makes sense. That is a very good point, yeah.
So, Peter, I will ask that age-old, timeless question. Was this episode any good?
Yeah, this episode was an absolute blast. As mentioned, it plays with the existing formula in some really fun ways. It's got some really fun action. It's got some really cool animation. It's got an absolutely awesome antagonist. This episode rules.
This was one of my favorites that we've covered in a while on the show, and I put a lot of that down to the writer Diane Duane for changing up the formula of the show and using Cupcake in a different way than we've seen before, and not having a damsel in distress running around. I got very sick of those kinds of characters, like in the Three Musketeers episode. I get tired of that kind of formula over and over again, where there's some lady being chased around by bad guys and then they have to save her. This episode totally upends that and does something very different, and getting into all this Norse mythology stuff was very cool. And Grimhild is one of my favorite characters they've had on the show. So yeah, 2 thumbs up to Fjords and Sorcery. So Peter, how can people keep up with us and find out about all the wonderful things we are doing?
Listeners can follow me on Blue Sky at petervolfranc.bsky.social.
And they can follow me on Blue Sky at joeblevins.bsky.social. They can find this podcast online at thesedaysaroours.libsyn.com. And they can email us with questions, comments, and concerns at thesedaysaroourspodcast@gmail.com. So Peter, what do we have on the docket next time we talk?
Well, back to Damsels in Distress, as the Happy Days gang travels to ancient Rome in There's No Place Like Rome.
I knew there had to be an ancient Rome episode. I was wondering when they were going to get to it. I'm glad we're finally getting to it next time. So see you later, alligator.
In a while, crocodile.
There was a group of witches, 365, I think, and they would destroy house, barns, wheat fields, fences. In the center of this town where they hang the people, they make a big fire in the center of the square and burn up these witches and people. It's in a circle. They get the witches and the plain people who lost their parents. They found that the town hall gave the preference of the witches that were left behind to be hung, and then they would be burned too. Let's see now. These witches used to blame the Ku Klux Klan for not helping them out. They wanted them to come along and watch and see. When they found out, they put them up to the altar. I don't know how good the story is. Is it all right? This all happened. It all happened in the history book. It's there. Not all of it, but some part of it. I think it was 15 years ago, 16 years ago, the 18th century. In the history book, it tells exactly 18-something, 1904, 1905. That was the First World War. Something like that. And that was when these witches and Ku Klux Klan came into existence. And it's bad for the people.
I have been tricked.